Well, hello there, guys. It's time for everybody's favourite part of the paper, Section B, the poetry section. We'll start by going through the question, and then we'll go through both poems, and then we'll talk about how we will approach these poems before we write an answer. So it tells us to spend about 1 hour on this section, even though it's only worth the same amount of marks as we would have had for the essay section on the Of Mice and Men. And that's because we need longer. We've never seen these poems. You've read Of Mice and Men lots and lots of times. You've gone through all kinds of quotations lots and lots of times. But you've never read these poems. You don't know which poems you're going to get. So the extra time is for you to go through the poems for a moment before you start writing and think really carefully about what you intend to write, so that when you do start writing, you get a coherent answer rather than just a mess of words that you put down because you were panicking. Even tells you in the question, think carefully before you write your answer. If an examiner tells you to do it on their exam paper that they wrote, the chances are high that you should probably do it. Now, they always tell you this bit up the top here. Both poets describe their feelings about time passing on a day in April. It might not always be that exact sentence, but it's always going to be something kind of like that you're going to end up getting in yours. So it would be something like both poems talk about, or both poets describe. They tell you what both the poems are about. If they tell it to you at the top of the poem, you might as well use the information that they've given you to help you. The question is always the same. Write about both poems and their effect on you. Show how they are similar and how they are different. The question is always the same. This question never changes. The poems it's about are what changes. So it tells you to write about both poems. Do not leave one poem out. When it says here, their effect on you, this is a little bit of a tricky one because the poems are designed to create a response in the reader. They are written specifically to create an emotional effect in the reader. But you might not feel that emotional effect from the poem. The poem might not be the right poem for you to create that effect on you personally. Equally, you are in an exam situation when you answer these poems. Likely you feel stressed or worried or bored, but you probably don't actually feel however the poem wants you to feel. So what you need to do is think about the effect that the poem was making, the effect that the poet was using those words to create, not how you actually personally feel at that time. When it says here, show how they are similar, you need to include these parts all the time. How are they similar? How are they different? How are they creating this effect? How are they doing that? In your head, always think how, and when you show it, use quotations to support that. And you need to be thinking about how they're similar and how they are different. You need to compare them and contrast them. Now, you might be lucky and you might get these bullet points afterwards. They tell you you can write about each poem separately and then compare them, or you can make comparisons where appropriate in your answer as a whole. Your teacher will probably guide you on a structure that they think is best for you, but either of these ones is fine according to the exam board. And again, we've got a you may wish to from an examiner. Now, as we know, if an examiner says you may wish to do something, what they mean is do it or else. So here's what they're saying. Think about the content of the poems. What are they about? Think about the ideas they wanted you to think about, the mood and atmosphere of the poems, how the poems are written, the words and phrases that are interesting, the way they're organised and so on, and your responses to the poems, including how they are similar and how they are different. Now, what's important about this section that you need to think about is that it's not just the structure that you need to write in. You can use it as a starting point if you're stuck, but you don't have to write your answer in this structure. You just use it to help you get some ideas started. That's the idea behind that. Now, you might have seen something very similar to this that has been done by your teachers. If you are not in my class, you were probably taught Art Wars by your teacher. If you are in my class, you were probably taught the equally useful but much more childish Fart Wars. Now, it's exactly the same as Art Wars, except that the F at the beginning is for the first and final line. So if we get ourselves a little box over here, we can remember our art wars. We need to think about what's the poem about. In my version though, we're going to start by looking at the first and final line, just to help us get an idea of structure, an idea of where the poem's going. Once we've done that, then we will think about what the poem's about. Then we'll think about any repeated ideas in the poem. Then we will think about the tone of the poem. We'll think about any words that stick out in the poem. We'll think about alliteration, but that's kind of a stand-in because it's not just alliterations, it's all the techniques we might see. Being careful not to feature spot. We'll think about rhyme and rhythm of the poem. Rhyme and rhythm. Ooh, rhythm. And we'll think about the structure of the poem. By doing that, it's exactly the same as this idea of the bullet points. It's not a structure for us to write our answer. If you get really stuck, it's nice to give yourself a starting point, and that's why we often look at the first and final line in my class, just to give us a first paragraph so that we're not completely stuck, because we often sit down to the poems, look at the poems and go, I have no idea and I'm frightened by these poems. And that's fine, but we need to have a strategy to get around that. But these do exactly the same as these bullet points do, which is that they just give you a direction to start looking at the poems, not necessarily telling you the order of your answer. Instead, you want to think more about how these poems show the feelings about time passing on a day in April. So if we start by reading through the poems now, and then we will move on and analyse them in a little bit more detail. This morning, I could do 1,000 things. I could fix the leaky pipe under the sink, or wander over and bother Jerry, who's lost in the bog of his crankcase. I could drive the half-mile down to the local mall and browse through the bright stables of mowers, or maybe catch the power walkers puffing away on their last laps. I could clean the garage, weed the garden, or get out the shears and prune those rose bushes back. Yes, 1,000 things this beautiful April morning. But I've decided to just lie here in this old hammock, rocking like a lazy metronome, and wait for the day lilies to open. The sun is barely over the trees, and already the sprinklers are out, raining their immaculate bands of light over the lawns. And in the second poem, we have In Your Absence. Not yet summer, but the unseasonable heat pries open the cherry tree. It stands there stupefied in its sham pink frills, dense with early blooming. Then, as afternoon cools into more furtive winds, I look up to see a blizzard of petals rushing the sky. It is only April. I can't stop my own life from hurrying by. The moon, already pacing. Now we know that we're looking at the idea of time, but before I move on to that, I just want to point out this little asterisk here, the little star next to the word metronome. If the examiner thinks that you are unlikely to know a word, they might gloss the word for you. They'll put the definition of the word. So here you've got the word metronome, and they say it's an instrument for keeping time or rhythm. If you've ever seen anyone playing a piano or something similar with the little ticking clock thing above it to help them keep in a steady pace, that's what they're doing here. That's to help them keep time or rhythm. So what we need to do is we need to look at both of the poems. Now what we could do, just to help ourselves out, is start with the first and final lines. That's what I'd like to do. So let's look at the first line of each poem and the last line of each poem. So we've got the first line of each poem and the last line of each poem. Now, if I look at the first line of this, I could fix the leaky pipe, and then here you've got the sprinklers bending like bands of light straight. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. That was new. Let's not do that. I wanted to do this instead. There we go. I could fix the leaky pipe. You've got this idea of the conditional could. Like you could do it, but you might not. I could fix the leaky pipe. I might not. It's the idea as well of this leaky pipe. It's the idea of something dripping away, like time is dripping away. In the last line here, though, we come back to this image of water moving. The sprinklers are out, raining their immaculate bands of light all over the lawns. It's almost as though Here, maybe time is dripping, 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 dripping. But here, because he's accepted the time or kind of allowed it to happen, there's a different idea of time moving at the end of the poem. It's almost more positive. A drippy pipe is something bad or something to be fixed, whereas this one is more intentional and more fun. In your absence, we've got not yet summer. So oh, for goodness sake, I've done that twice now. So straight away, we've got the idea that it's not yet summer. Summer is a time, so we're thinking about April. It's the idea that there's something coming up, or like something that we're waiting for. The idea of waiting for something to happen. The idea of maybe some kind of tension of something not happening yet through the words not yet. But then look at how that word not yet is contrasted here with the word already. So you've got that word already. Well, that's the opposite of tension. That's something that has happened previously. It's not tension anymore. It's closed almost. It's an ending. The moon is the thing that's pacing or ending. Well, the moon is obviously kind of symbolizing nighttime, but again, night is the end of the day. It's the end of the story. It's the end point of the poem, and it's summed up here. So rather than having this idea of the sun and summer at the beginning, you've got the moon at the ending. And the moon is pacing. So it's this idea that the moon is already moving, already ready to go. And perhaps the idea of pacing, suggesting that idea of time. Think about the pace of something being how fast it goes. It links in with that idea of time, moving onwards, maybe hurrying, like it says in the line before. Now we've only looked at 4 lines total here, but these 4 lines have already given us a way into the poem. It gives us a starting point, a place to look. They don't tell us everything about the poem though, so we need to look at, we know what the poems are about, right? But the poems are about time passing on a day in April. So let's look and see if we can find anything more to do with this time passing idea going on. The idea of wandering is moving slowly. We've got this idea of Jerry, who's lost in the bog of his crankcase. We'll go back to that one later. You could talk about maybe driving somewhere, catching power walkers. Well, they're going to be people who move fast. And they're puffing away on their last laps. So they are ending something, but they're moving quickly. All these jobs that could be done. And then is pointing out that it's just a morning in April. It's just early. But instead, they've decided to lie down still in the old hammock. So the idea that it's not a new hammock. It's the idea that time can pass a little bit more slowly there. Rocking like a lazy metronome. Now, a metronome shows that time is still passing, but it's the idea that it's moving lazily, slowly. And wait for the daylilies to open. So the idea of waiting for daytime. The sun is used here. Oh, we saw the sun being used in another one. That's kind of useful. It's barely over the trees, and already the sprinklers are out, raining. So again, we've got this already. We had that before. Already. That was in the other poem. I saw that. The sprinklers are out, raining their immaculate bands of light over the lawns. So you have this movement of time. I wonder if we can see something similar in the other poem. Unseasonable heat. Well, that's heat that's going to be in the wrong time period. The idea that it pries open the cherry tree. Well, we had this idea of the daylilies going on here. Let's see if we can get like an arrow. That would kind of work. The idea of time having an effect on nature there. Oh, I like the arrow. That's nice. We'll do that again. It stands there stupefied. Well, we totally have this idea of stupefied kind of coming through in this one, like a lazy metronome just lying there. But this is the tree, the cherry tree. So this is like the flowers are just stupefied rather than a person. And its sham pink frills dense with early blooming. This idea again that it's maybe early or ahead of time. Then, well, that's straight away going to tell us that there's been a movement of time from one point to another. As afternoon cools into more furtive winds. So we've gone straight into the afternoon here. Time's moved much more quickly in this poem than in this one. Into more furtive winds. I look up to see a blizzard of petals rushing the sky. The idea of a blizzard or something rushing, that's really interesting. A blizzard would be to do with snow, but this is petals So it's to do with the spring and the unseasonable heat. Again, it's this idea of something being wrong or out of place in time, maybe. This idea of the wind being furtive and rushing the sky as though it's almost stealing something or taking something away. It is only April. So the idea that time is not maybe moving on at the pace that the person in the poem expects it to, because it's only April, but all of these things have already happened. I can't stop my own life from hurrying by. So they're kind of saying they struggle, they can't stop their own life from rushing. Well, you could totally compare that to this other person here, because this other person, time moves on, but they've chosen to just be a lazy metronome. They've chosen to just swing backwards and forwards. So you've got this difference in it. Now we've gone straight away through this idea that there's this about through it, and there's this repeated idea of time moving forwards, but we've also seen this idea of this repeated idea of maybe nature being used or nature elements. So if we look as well, we had the idea of the sun, we had the idea of summer going on up here and unseasonable heat being used, and we had the idea here of the kind of trees and the way that the weather is behaving. Here it's already kind of moving onwards how it is. You've got this idea repeated in both the poems as well of the idea of April. Now in this first poem, it has its own repeated ideas internally, because if you look through it, it's got all of these different ideas of how this person could be behaving, how this person could be doing all of these different tasks. So look at all the tasks that are listed that could have been things that they could have done. They could do this. Actually, let's get the highlighter for all the times it says could. I could do this, and then the list of all the things, or maybe do this, or maybe I could do that. I could clean the garage, or I could do this. I could do 1,000 things. So there's all this listing going on above it, which I guess we could have as one of our techniques here. We've got all this listing of the tasks that they could do. We could, if we could, make the box work. There we go. We've got a listing of all the tasks that they could do. And then we've got all the tasks that they could do listed right there. And because of that, it means that you can see this idea of time moving onwards there. This idea that there are all these things that could be happening, and it contrasts them with this second part of the poem. So you've got all of those listed things they could do above that, and then below it you've got this kind of what they're going to do instead, this lazy time they're going to have instead on the morning. They could do all of these things, all of these activities, but there's a contrast instead. Meanwhile, in this one, we have this idea of activity, but it's almost inescapable. This person feels like they can't avoid this hurry that's going on in the first one. Even the moon is already pacing. Life is moving onwards, moving onwards, moving onwards, and they can't seem to stop it. You've got the difference in the titles there as well. This morning I could do 1,000 things. Now this morning I could do 1,000 things. You got the 1,000 things put up here, all the things they could do. But instead, you've got what they decide to do instead. Here, in your absence, something's missing, and you can see this person feeling like their life is maybe speeding by with something missing in it. And so we've looked at some of the repeated ideas. We've talked about the tone to some degree. We've talked about some of the words that are similar between the two of them. You might find others. Don't rely just on this. Any different version of this that you can support with quotations is good. So if we talk about some of the techniques that are being used here, we've got this rather lovely one here, which I really like, which is Jerry who's lost in the bog of his crankcase. Jerry's crankcase is not an actual bog, right? I'm not, going to just have a crankcase bog. That doesn't make sense. The crankcase is the case, the cover that the crankshaft is in his engine. Jerry's just doing work on his engine in his car. But describing him as lost in the bog, well, that's a metaphor, because, it would be a metaphor if I could type. That's a metaphor, because he's not really lost in it. But we can't just say it's a metaphor, because if I just stuck the tag metaphor on there and said nothing else, that would be feature spotting. If in an essay I wrote something like, Jerry is lost in the bog of his crankcase, which is a metaphor because his crankcase isn't really a bog, that gives me no marks, really, because the examiner goes, yeah, I know what a metaphor is too, thank you though. Instead, if I say, Jerry, who's lost in the bog of his crankcase, is a metaphor, and in this case the metaphor is being used to show that he is maybe trapped in his task. The idea of a bog gives the idea of maybe effort, or slow moving. The idea that there's this sense of difficulty or slow moving starting straight away. That's kind of indicated in wander as well, the idea of moving slowly. Browse, again, is kind of this idea of moving slowly, not very effortfully through something. Whereas Jerry is lost in this bog, in this mire, he's trapped in something. That could tell you something. So you've got all of those ideas going through there. What's great is that we have some of that going on in the other poem. So if you look here, we've got the unseasonable heat pries open the cherry tree. Now, this is personification. The cool thing about personification is all personification is metaphor, but not all metaphor is personification. In the same way that all Mars bars are chocolate bars, but not all chocolate bars are Mars bars. So personification is a type of metaphor, and it's the type of metaphor where you say that something has human characteristics where it doesn't really have human characteristics. In this one, the unseasonable heat, the heat is already being described as being out of place, and the idea that it's prying open the cherry tree makes it seem like it's doing something wrong or out of place or unnecessary. And to pry it open sounds almost quite violent towards the tree, almost like something is maybe being stolen or taken away. And the tree just stands there stupefied. So the tree is stopped. It doesn't know what to do. In its sham pink frills, dense with early blooming. By describing it as pink frills, it makes it sound almost feminine, but almost like a victim of what's happening to it by the heat. Then when you have this movement here, afternoon cools into more furtive winds, and we talked about this word furtive. Again, this idea that there's something secretive about that links into this idea of personification, that something's wrong, violent, or has been stolen. And here then, again, we have another metaphor, a blizzard of petals rushing the sky. Well, we talked about this idea a little bit earlier. We said that a blizzard is usually snow. Oh, I keep doing zeros instead of dashes, sorry guys. Snow, and snow is out of place. We talked about this idea of something being out of place up here, unseasonable heat. This is out of place in the poem because we're talking about a poem that's set in unreasonable heat, but also this idea that it's out of place in April, you wouldn't normally expect to see it. And it shows the extent of the petals, the idea that there's so many petals, the idea that they're rushing the sky, almost like the time is being rushed on, because it's only April and we're already thinking about blizzards and winter. It is only April. So this idea is kind of heightened up there. I can't stop my own life from hurrying by, the moon already pacing. And again, you've got that moon behaving in that same way that's personification. The idea that the moon is already trying to hurry you on, push you on, or pace you on. So you've got all of these ideas coming through here in this poem. Let's talk about the rhyme and rhythm of the two poems. So, in some ways, life is made easy in both of these poems because there is no regular line length in either poem. There is no regular rhyme scheme in either of the poems. So instead, what we can do is we can just look at them in terms of the effect that they create. Now, this poem, This Morning I Could Do 1,000 Things, it's got an irregular line length. They're all sort of vaguely similar line lengths in terms of how many syllables per line, but they're not particularly close. But it's this idea that perhaps maybe it doesn't need such a strict kind of harsh line length. If you think about it like a lazy metronome, maybe it's the idea that it's intentionally lazy. The idea is that it's supposed to sound like a lazy afternoon on a hammock, not like a very strict, structured poem. So perhaps it sounds, you know, free, not strict in the way that it's put together. Whereas if you think about a really strict rhythm or a really strict rhyme scheme, that might have made it sound a little bit less like the morning that could be kind of floating away on a metronome. In Your Absence also doesn't have regular line lengths or a regular rhyme scheme, but the one thing that is interesting is, oh, for goodness sake, I will learn, I promise, guys. The one thing that's really different is that in Your Absence, the line lengths are so much shorter, not than each other, because they're actually really reasonably kind of similar around the whole poem. They're sort of within the realms of 4, 5, 6 syllables a line throughout the whole poem. But instead, the idea that they're shorter than This Morning I Could Do 1,000 Things. The idea that maybe it shows more how time is rushing by. Like the idea that the poem sounds more rushed. The structure of the poem makes it sound more rushed. And you have that idea coming through in the structure of the poem as well, because whereas, and so look, we're on the last one, guys, we're nearly there, we're nearly done. Whereas the structure of This Morning I Could Do 1,000 Things is like one long lazy morning. It's all one stanza and it shows how it's kind of just joined together and merges together. In Your Absence is split up into these short stanzas, which almost seem to be rushing by or pushing by because they're so short that by the time you've kind of read one stanza, it's gone. Each stanza only has really one sentence except the last stanza. So it's this idea that there's so little time in each movement and each moment going on there. So we've kind of gone through this idea of fart wars to help us get a structure together. What you've noticed though is it doesn't tell us exactly what to write in each paragraph. Now we can decide an order, and what I like to do in my own personal notes is maybe just quickly at the bottom of the page write a little bullet point order of what I'm going to write about roughly in each paragraph, so that I have a general idea. But you can easily just put numbers on your annotations or however it is that you like to do it, that's fine. The important thing is that you've thought about what you're going to write before you start writing, and you've noticed this isn't like a perfect summary of what every single part of the poem is about, because we're not being asked for that. We're being asked to write about the effect of both poems, how they're similar and different, and we can pull those things out relatively quickly. So now that we've gone through all of those things, we could start to write our answer. We're looking for 20 marks worth of an answer, so think about it being sort of a similar length maybe to your OMAM May essay, somewhere in that region. Try to split it into paragraphs, make sure that each paragraph has a topic sentence, it tells me what the paragraph is about. Use that point evidence explain structure if you can. This is where you should be kind of aiming in your answer, for something that is in paragraphs and makes sense. You will have more information from your teacher about how you're going to complete this on Classroom, but have a fantastic day and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye!